this in. Yeah, so welcome back to session 4, I think. We're at 4 now. Yeah, this is the 4th session, so that's exciting. This is the 4th session of the Uncloak Cryptography study group, so welcome back. Here in the 3rd column, or 4th column. And ideally, we would like our hash functions to be quick. And historically, our hash functions had to sort of take a longer time, I think, per bit to produce a non-deterministic output. But more recently, we've been able to get some reasonably good results with 5 or fewer cycles per bit on our hash functions, while still producing collision-resistant and pre-image-resistant hash functions. So yeah, and there's a couple of nuances here to pull out. The main nuance in this chapter is about, I think, the Merkle-Damgard construction, which is to how hash functions were constructed for SHA-2. And the basic premise here is that you take your arbitrarily long message, break it down into blocks, and you go block 1, block 2, block 3, etc., and you repeatedly apply some function that crunches the next block into the output of the pre-existing or the previous block's function evaluation, and you come out with this final hash. So the final hash of this particular construction, the Merkle-Damgard construction, has proven to be collision resistant and pre-image attack resistant, but it wasn't actually as resistant as we might like to. It's called a length extension attack, and I sort of realized later that the book doesn't actually cover the book does not actually cover length extension attacks very well. And the whole premise behind a length extension attack, which I think they talk a little bit about in chapter 6, but I would like them to go a little bit more into detail. The whole premise of a length extension attack is that you have the output of your hash function, which lives over here, the final hash, and the input of, or the output of your hash function can be known by the attacker. So the attacker now has the hash function output, right? But the attacker might say, well, I would like to add maybe block 7 to this hash function. And since I have the final hash, it's only one more application of f to say, if I have f of some message, and I would like to extend the message with some further suffix, then the attacker can actually do that. And this is particularly concerning if the message is something that you would like the attacker not to be able to arbitrarily interfere with. Like, for instance, if the attacker sees the hash of the message, I am the user Bob, and I have some private key, the attacker doesn't actually need to get the private key. They can append maybe some additional message in addition to I am some user Bob and I have some private key. The attacker can append, say, and I would like to give money to Alice or something. So the attacker in this scenario basically can say, I am going to come up with block 7 and so on and change the message, and now I have the hash of a message, which is why a hash function in the Merkle-Damgard construction is imperfect for some reasons, because sometimes if the attacker can extend the message arbitrarily, it can be quite bad for the security of the hash function. Even though the hash function itself has no problems, it's the attacker's ability to take the output of the hash function and do with it what they would like. So we got from the Merkle-Damgard construction to the sponge construction in SHA-3, and I'm covering things that aren't exactly in the book now, because the book predates SHA-3's standardization. And I think I should have probably assigned a little bit more on sponge constructions, honestly. But the main point of a sponge construction is that you have, as before, some message, and you can basically run that message through a sequence of function applications. But the function applications allow you to squeeze. There's an absorbing phase and a squeezing phase in a sponge construction. The absorbing phase takes in some message, and the message is contained in P0 through Pn. And then you can continue to reapply the same function to squeeze out the random bytes of the hash function. So the absorbing and squeezing phase means that the attacker would need to take Pn-1 and the output after Pn-1, and then insert their message in here. But since they don't actually have the output of the message after Pn-1, they will only have the output after Z0, Z1, and so on. They can't arbitrarily insert their own suffix to the message. So that's sort of the intuition behind why SHA-3 is relevant. And I'm going to do a check-in. How's the sound on the stream? If someone could check in with me on that.
My side of things sounds really great, but
cool. All right, yeah. And maybe then to wrap up a little bit on this natter, the book turns its attention to some historical hash functions that have been broken, MD5 and SHA-1. And there are reasons to use MD5 and SHA-1 in practice, but the reasons generally are that the collision or the collision resistance of the hash function actually isn't that important. So if you need a hash function where it's not actually threatening that the attacker could determine a collision between the hash function's evaluations, and you only care about a speedy hash function evaluation, there are reasons to reach for SHA-1. But more recently, SHA-1 is faster than SHA-2 or SHA-3, but so too are more new constructions like Blake 1 through 3 are all pretty fast in terms of speed. So the traditional reason to use SHA-1 is that there are only like 18 cycles per bit, as opposed to something like SHA-2, which I suppose maybe the correct sort of analysis here is not actually cycles per bit, but the actual runtime, which I guess I don't have in front of me. But anyway, newer constructions and hash functions have fairly efficient runtimes with respect to how they produce outputs. So Blake 2 and Blake 3, its successor, are well recommended for speedy hash function evaluation with comparable runtimes to SHA-1. And Blake 2 has been used in not a small number of places. So you might be familiar with some of these projects, Zcash, Argon 2, which is a password hashing company, or a password hashing algorithm. IPFS, there are a lot of places that Blake 2 has landed. Blake 3, I think, was published just 2 years ago, so it's had a little bit less time to trickle out. But these are reasonably well understood and high performance hash functions that exist. And I suppose I mentioned Pedersen hashes and Poseidon hashes at the top. Those are hashes specifically designed to be computed inside of ZK circuits, which tend to be sort of constrained computing environments. You want somewhat structured hash functions such that you don't have to blow up your circuit arbitrarily to, I think, on the order of I think the last I heard, you can include a hash function evaluation of Poseidon and on the order of 10 new gates in your circuit, where including SHA-2 or SHA-3 would be thousands or even hundreds of thousands of gates added to your circuit. So the Blake construction is structured on the Cha-Cha cipher, which we'll be talking about a little bit next week, because Cha-Cha 20-Poly 1305 is probably the most well recommended authenticated encryption scheme, and we'll be talking about authenticated encryption next week. So I suppose that it would probably be worthwhile, and I suppose I'd probably
before we get too far off of the hashing, we did have a question from the YouTube from Sergey asking about, can we use the same F functions in both MD constructions and in Sponge? So I guess what's used in, SHA-3.
Okay.
Which I guess.
Yeah. Can we use it in MD construction? Actually, that's a good question. I do not know, and I'd have to get back to you on that. I think when he says MD, he's talking about MD5, but I could be wrong about that. So I'll have to get back to you on that, Sergey. Thanks for the question. And Anand asked, what is the hash construction of Blake 2, Blake 3? So Blake 2 and Blake 3 are constructed on Cha-Cha or Salsa, which is a similar construction, which I think you can read more about. But basically the premise is that there's a series of permutations and XORs that I suppose this diagram isn't the clearest, I suppose, about what Blake does, but the quick take is basically that it's constructed from the Cha-Cha stream cipher. So it's based on a stream cipher is I think the takeaway there. And if you'd like to read more about it, check out the Wikipedia and maybe look into Blake 2 and Blake 3. And I think this week's homework actually had an exercise using Blake 3, so we might dip over into that. And I suppose I should have probably gone into homework before diving straight into the hash functions, so I think we'll sort of go in a slightly inverse order today. So before we dive out of hash functions, does anyone have any other questions on hash functions before we dive into homework? Okay, don't see any questions just yet. Oh, MD construction, and that they both use sponge with an F inside, and how interchangeable are they? Yeah, I'm actually not sure. I'm not sure to Sergey's question. I'd have to go look that up. So, but if you happen to come across an answer, I'd love to know. So yeah, wandering into the notes from session 3. So we had a couple of exercises from this week. The exercises for this week were somewhat split in that Chapter 5 was a little bit more implementation oriented and Chapter 6 was a little bit more theoretical. Running through the solutions from Chapter 3, the Chapter 5 exercises were, let's see, so the exercises from Chapter 3 were based around doing truncation of SHA-512. So basically, to have completed the homework here, you would want to go ahead and grab any library that does hashing. So I used the Ring library, which is a lower level cryptography library in Rust. It's the back end of a couple of other cryptography libraries, most notably Rust TLS, which is a rewrite of OpenSSL in Rust and is generally known to be high production quality. And because it's written with its implementation in Rust, roughly every 6 months, there's a bug that is published in OpenSSL that reduces to there was a buffer overread or a problem with some particular implementation of C++ or C that allowed an attacker to read farther than they should have been able to. So the Rust TLS library and Ring come well recommended. The homework for this week was to construct a hash function and find some collisions. And so collisions, as we mentioned at the top, are basically they're sort of like apotheosis of how to do hash functions such that they are the main sort of attack that we're afraid of usually when we think about hash functions. So the algorithm here is to truncate the output of SHA-512. And the way we actually construct SHA, I think it's 372 or 376, there are several hash functions that we can construct that are just truncations of longer hash functions. And I see, so the the exercises in this week were largely focused around how long would it roughly take to find a collision. And this is a shortened version of the exercise in the book. The book asks, I think, the implementer to find a message that hashes to a couple of different values under SHA 512.16, 512.24, 512.32, and so on. And we would roughly expect that for SHA 512-N, if n is, for instance, 8, there are 2 to the 8 possible outputs. So we would expect to take roughly the, if we wanted to find a collision in 2 to the 8 possible outputs, we would take the square root of 2 to the 8, and we would assume that it would take probably on the order of 2 to the 4 possible outputs to find a collision. And to find a particular collision, like 3D, 4B, we would expect that to take 2 to the 8 attempts. So in this particular exercise, running the algorithm for 3D, 4B, you would expect the algorithm to take roughly, in this case, since there are, 16 possible, or 2 to the 16 possible outputs, you would expect this to take roughly on the order of 2 to the 16, or 65,300 something. So, yeah. The homework this week should not have been too challenging. The basic idea here was to get some practice sort of thinking about hash function collisions, since that's generally the sort of like main thing that we think about when we're thinking about the security of hash functions and whether hash functions are well chosen. So yeah. Also, I've been trying to structure the homework such that I think the homework should be approachable from a perspective of, if you'd like to dive deeper on any particular topic, the homework should be doable without too much hurdle, but should also suggest in ways that you might like to continue if you wanted to explore hash functions further. So for this particular homework, the goal here was to explore a couple of different hash functions and see their runtime, and maybe even invite the audience to take a look at these hash functions and see how they differ. So the last exercise of the homework for this week was the benchmarking of several algorithms, SHA-2, SHA-3, and Blake 3, that is. And so you can time your implementations however you'd like, or time these implementations however you'd like. But the goal here, I think, should be that you should be able to say, oh, okay, so this hash function and that hash function evaluate in some reasonably comparable runtime, and Criterion is the usual go-to benchmarking tool for statistically sound benchmarking in Rust. I think we had an exercise about that on the first week, but the output of your function here should basically be demonstrative that Blake runs fairly quickly. So yeah, and if we dive back over to the course notes for last week, yeah, I suppose there was one particular reading. Is it necessarily? No, you can do the exercises in whatever language you'd like, although this course is specifically centered around the Rust programming language, since I think there's generally an emphasis in cryptography on generating secure code, and so Rust is quite good at that. So a lot of cryptography in practice is written in Rust. So running back over here. So let's wander into MACs. So MACs, or message authentication codes, are the primary way that we do authentication. So the whole premise in authentication is that if you, let's say Alice and Bob, bringing up Alice and Bob, Alice wants to prove to Bob that she is who she says she is, because if she doesn't, then Eve can arbitrarily say, Well, if I just happened to get, if Eve just happened to tamper with the message, then Bob has no way of knowing that Alice didn't send garbage. And if even worse, Eve has some structured way to tamper with the message that decrypts to something that Alice hadn't meant to send, then Eve has basically corrupted the encryption system such that Bob has no way of knowing whether or not Alice sent garbage or whether Eve interrupted the channel by tampering with messages. So authentication is this fairly useful primitive in the sense that without authentication, an adversary is... We might be able to determine that the message is garbage, but we wouldn't be able to determine that the message was necessarily tampered with. So we use message authentication codes to basically prevent that problem. And they're fairly straightforward primitive in that you just want to basically take the hash of a key and a message, and if Bob and Alice share the key, and Alice sends the message in plain text, or Alice sends the message encrypted, whatever the message is, the MAC should generally say, okay, so it's clear that the message was, or that the MAC should clearly be able to determine whether or not the message was tampered with en route. And there are a couple of ways to construct MACs. We can take the MAC of the ciphertext after the message has been encrypted. We can take the MAC of the message itself and encrypt both the MAC and the message, and have Bob decrypt the MAC and the message. And there are a couple of different constructions that we can use here. But the most commonly used ones, well, it sort of varies depending on situation, whether you would take the MAC first or encrypt first. And there's a short section about that in chapter 7, I think 7.2 or 7.3. But the general reason that you would want to take the MAC of the ciphertext as opposed to the MAC, encrypt the MAC in the message, is that if you take the MAC of the ciphertext, then it's much quicker to determine whether or not Eve tampered with the message, because you can just do a quick check of the MAC before decrypting. And checking the MAC is just a check of the hash function as opposed to decrypting the entire message. So checking an MAC is usually reasonably quick. So it's better for DDoS protection, which is a sort of common concern in adversarial untrusted environments, like online. It's fairly trivial for Bob to say, okay, so I want DDoS protection, so I'm just going to check the MAC before I bother decrypting. And so for environments that the receiving party could potentially be DDoSed by spam messages, oftentimes the MAC will be constructed of the ciphertext. But for environments that are a little bit less likely to be abused or DDoSed, it's sometimes acceptable to take the MAC inside of the encryption. That is, to take the MAC of the message and then encrypt both the message and the MAC and just send the ciphertext. The advantage to that is that the MAC is of what Alice actually said as opposed to the encryption of what Alice said. And historically there's been like maybe a couple of times that that's been highly important in the sense that the reason that you'd want to do that is that it gives Eve even less information. She doesn't have the MAC of the ciphertext and she doesn't have the MAC of the message. Eve has concretely less. The same amount of data is still sent over the wire, but because you just encrypt the message and the MAC, so the extension of the message with the tag is still the same. But the result, the end result here is that if Eve has just concretely less to work with, then she is even less able to know what's going on between Alice and Bob's communications. But MACs don't actually reveal anything about the message that they are computed over by the property of preimage resistance of hash functions. So generally, most protocols that I've seen do encrypt first and then take the MAC of the message. We can talk about that a little bit more. more soon. So the whole premise here is that we have this ideal premise of an MAC, that it's a random mapping from this input, which is Alice's message or Alice's ciphertext, as it may be, to the output, which is some random string that Bob can verify that represents Alice's message. So an attack on an MAC is any way of distinguishing the output from randomness, and this should basically run back straight to hash functions. Which, if we model a hash function as a random oracle, that is, a hash function produces randomness, then that's our sort of like ideal model of what a hash function should be. It should be this oracle for some random output. And so basically we want exactly that for an MAC. We want the output of whatever Alice puts into the MAC to look like, we want the output to look random. So breaking an MAC is more or less just a question of like whether or not the underlying hash function is broken. And we're going to get to next week the topic of authenticated encryption, and there's a couple of things to talk about with respect to authentication and encryption. Namely, that it's hard to do it right, and so there are a couple of libraries that I think I mentioned the week before, AEAD libraries, where the whole premise of an AEAD is that it's hard to screw up using an AEAD, and that it does the authentication for you and it does the encryption for you. And so the homework for next week is going to be largely using not just, and this is somewhat why I didn't assign homework, implementation homework for using any of the CMAC or HMAC or GMAC sort of implementations, is that ultimately you're rarely going to actually reach directly for CBC MAC or HMAC themselves. You're almost certainly going to reach for an AEAD instead. So it's more important, I think, conceptually to understand the premise of message authentication codes than it is to actually be able to reach for their implementations, because you almost certainly will be using an authenticated encryption scheme as opposed to reaching for an MAC themselves. So the theory behind sort of how to construct a good MAC is relatively interesting and important. And we can generally construct an MAC out of anything that produces random output. And so besides hash functions, block ciphers and stream ciphers are also known to produce random output. So they're another common grab for cryptography or for MAC constructions. So the book gives the specific example of CMAC, which has been sort of less popular over time. I think it's largely because it's a little bit slower than the alternative constructions out of stream ciphers. The alternative constructions from stream ciphers are generally of the case that you'd want to you basically just want a random stream of input to XOR your data with, and then crunch it into some hash. So the CBC MAC and CMAC approach to constructing AES ciphers is known to be somewhat slower than the alternative. But I think it's brought up here as a sort of like canonical example of how you would use CBC to construct a stream of data such that you could construct an MAC. But more common these days are to use specifically what's described in the book as GMAC. HMAC was popular with SHA-2 because it was a way of denying length extension attacks. But if you're going to use a modern hash function that is not vulnerable to length extension attacks, HMAC's advantages sort of drop off in the sense that HMAC is required to evaluate two hash functions to construct an MAC. But the whole premise with the sponge construction hash functions is that you aren't worried about length extension attacks. So HMAC's vulnerability to length extension means that you pay in performance for this security of HMAC. But there are hash functions, perfectly good hash functions, that aren't vulnerable to length extension attacks nowadays, including the hash function that underlies GMAC, which is AES GCM mode, if I'm remembering correctly, which is a sort of stream cipher mode of AES that's secure. And even more common nowadays is to use cha-cha-20 as the hash function, which underlies the AEAD that we'll talk about next week, which is cha-cha-20 poly 1305. So he asks specifically which MAC to choose. And this is actually something that I wanted to draw attention to. The answer to which MAC to choose is something that I suppose I've been hammering away at for the last 10 minutes or so. The answer is none. Don't choose an MAC. The whole premise with choosing an MAC assumes that you choose your encryption scheme and your MAC separately. And there are a lot of common mistakes in even just reaching for these individual components, encryption and authentication, that knowing whether to encrypt first or MAC first, or to take the MAC of the plain text or take the MAC of the ciphertext or whatever else, and then being able to transmit that data to the receiving party and having them know whether to encrypt first or decrypt decrypt first or verify the MAC first. The answer is don't choose an MAC. Choose a authentication encryption scheme. So the whole premise of an AEAD is that they're standardized, authenticated encryption libraries, so that you can just take a single protocol off the shelf, which usually does what you intended to do anyway with encryption or with message authentication, and send a message that allows for a high degree of flexibility in that you do encryption, you do authentication, and you can also send what's the AD in AEAD is associated data. So you can send unencrypted associated data as well with respect to a message, like for instance a header that is public information. So a lot of the time when you're reaching for symmetric encryption primitives, the primitives that you need to know about are symmetric block ciphers and hash functions, which MACs are constructed from. But in fact, in practice, you're almost certainly going to be reaching for an authenticated encryption scheme. Diving back over to the exercises and the homework for this week. So the exercises for this week for Chapter 6 were a little bit more theoretical, in the sense that you should have a little bit of practice, I think, doing symbolic reasoning with hash functions and with authentication tags, especially since we're going to kind of shift in a more mathematically rigorous direction when we start talking about asymmetric encryption and asymmetric primitives in general. Because symmetric cryptography is relatively possible. It's possible to understand, I think, symmetric encryption without really diving too deep into like some of the security arguments that underlie why block ciphers are secure. But the sort of direction that we're going to be heading here, probably in about 3 weeks or so, is that we'll be diving a little bit more into the asymmetric cryptography primitives. And asymmetric cryptography primitives are a little bit harder to avoid mathematics with. This is a sort of like opportunity, I think, to maybe get a little bit more comfort with doing symbolic reasoning, doing mathematical reasoning at this stage. And if we come to asymmetric encryption and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, that's perfectly fine. It's kind of to be expected, honestly. But this avoiding the exercises that are a little bit more mathematical in nature might leave you feeling in the dust when we start talking about RSA and some Diffie-Hellman key exchange and all of that. So I just want to encourage, if you've only been tackling the sort of more implementation-heavy exercises and sort of avoiding the symbolic reasoning questions, maybe turn around and give them a shot. So hitting up on Chapter 6, the basic premise for Chapter 6, 6.3 is I think it's kind of a warm-up, in that you are given these you're given these tags, and given these tags, you can actually prove that Eve can determine a tag that doesn't exist. And this exercise isn't so interesting in practice. It's basically what Eve might think of as like a chosen authentication attack, in that it's entirely possible that you could send a 1 block long message, but it's not likely in practice that your messages will only be 1 block long, or 64 or 128 bits. A 16-byte message that is perfectly crafted for Eve, though, is entirely possible. So suppose that you encrypted, or suppose that you took the MAC of A and B, both 1 block messages, and there's a typo right there. Got this little parentheses dangling down. Suppose you took the MAC of these 1 block messages using CBCMAC. Well, you can actually determine that the attacker can develop a CBC tag for the A concatenated to B tag. Now, that's sort of like an arcane idea, in that, like, it's unlikely that this is going to happen in practice, but it is an interesting sort of exercise to come to it and sort of like think, well, could I develop a message authentication code that didn't have this property? Because obviously this diverges from our ideal property for message authentication codes. And the answer is yeah. You can absolutely develop an MAC where this is not the case. Because this is an attack on CBCMAC's structure. The CMAC structure here is what enables this attack. So this kind of goes back to SHA-3 and SHA-2. If you have a hash function where the MAC does not have this specific structure, then this attack becomes impossible. And so to avoid this attack, basically if we use modern MAC constructions like GMAC is the main one that comes to mind, but also JAWCHA20, this attack becomes impossible. Going to section 6.4. So this attack was basically the case that the attacker doesn't actually need the key to recover the message. The attacker can simply say, using they can do that by saying, well, I have these, I have this tag and I have this message. And again, it's an attack on CBCMAC. So like the real point to drive home here is that when you reach for an MAC, you sort of risk choosing an MAC that might not actually be the modern solution. And this is sort of, I think, the intention, I think, behind reaching for an AEAD, because your AEAD is likely to be more modern and more resistant, and that AEADs really only started to become standardized around 2007 and are now generally respected as like the thing to reach for. And then the final exercise for this week was that for message authentication, when would you use tuple hash and some other alternatives? So the reason to reach for these algorithms that are not specifically described in the book are because these constructions basically rely on the structure of SHA-3, the sponge construction. And you wouldn't actually be able to obtain these constructions using traditional hash functions like SHA-2 with the Merkle-Damgard construction. And so parallel hash, tuple hash, and KMAC are each hashing algorithms that are specifically designed to hash long messages or tuples of messages in parallel. KMAC is faster than HMAC as an alternative because HMAC is required to hash twice for every MAC produced, and KMAC is designed to hash once because it's not vulnerable to length extension attacks. So that sort of wraps up the homework. And I think before maybe peeking ahead to preview next week, inviting any questions from the chat and we might pivot over to talking about a couple of administrative things towards the end here. So, Chloe, did you have any comments?
No comments here. Just I know there's lots of discussion going on in like the Discord as well, while the study group's going on. So it's great to see that people are actively engaging in the content. So yeah, if people have questions, please feel free to also ask them live here, and we can address them. And then if you are continuing to dig deeper, I'm glad that you guys are enjoying that as well.
Yeah. I think we might pivot to talk about a couple of administrative things before we dive out here. The first thing is that study subgroups haven't been, I think, as successful as I was hoping. And I'm kind of thinking about ways to reorganize them. I was thinking about basically saying that the study subgroups, the original intention was that they should be a way for you to have a conversation with people that maybe feel a little bit more local to your sort of perspective. That is, the original interpretation was that if you had a sort of closed area to have conversations about topics, that maybe it would be a little bit easier and a little bit less intimidating to have conversations. Also, I was thinking that it's possible that study subgroups would arrange for their own sort of like private get-togethers to discuss homeworks, maybe aligned around like time zones. And so like I think that both of those things are probably still worthwhile, but I'm still thinking about the format of how to do that best. So right now what I'm leaning towards is the if there was going to be a restructuring of study groups, I wouldn't want to deconstruct study groups altogether. Any study group that still wants to exist can still exist. But I would suggest or ask for anyone who would like to lead a time zone local study group session local to like the American time zone area, the European and African time zone area, or the Asian time zone area. I'm kind of interested in what an alternative structure for the study groups, such that any subgroup that wanted to have a midweek meeting to discuss the homework and the reading and so on is something that I'd want to encourage. So I'm going to make an announcement about that in the chat after the stream. And yeah, addressing the question that popped up. Given that we have Blake 2.3, is there any reason to use SHA-3 anymore? I mean, standards, but I suppose there's a reason not to use Blake 3, and that's that it's 2 years old. And any algorithm that's 2 years old in Cryptography's book is still reasonably untested. Cryptography is inherently easier to know the security of, not only based on the proofs that underlie whether or not something is secure, but also the length of time that it continues to go unbroken. Blake 3 very much builds on the foundations of Blake 2, and I would probably direct anyone that was willing to sort of take a sort of marginal security risk on using a somewhat newer algorithm. Yeah, Blake 3 is probably secure, but is there any reason to use SHA-3 anymore? No, not really. Besides standards, the answer is like I kind of shrug a bit and say, well, sometimes you have to be in coordinates. You have to coordinate with standards, right? The other thing I suppose is like worth drawing attention to is that the standard is going to have had the largest degree of scrutiny on it for the longest time by like maybe the most mature developers or the most mature cryptographers. So I suppose like me making the steelman case for using SHA-3 would be that obviously there's been a lot of eyeballs and a lot of like hours spent trying to break SHA-3 and it's still not broken. So there's the reason to use SHA-3. But if you were willing to go slightly down on the eyeball security in exchange for performance trade-off, then yeah, I think it's a perfectly reasonable move to reach for Blake 2 instead, or Blake 3. So yeah. Maybe thing to wrap up on then. Thanks everyone for joining this week. I suppose I did feel a little bit like a troll for introducing MACs, only to say you'll never use these. Use an authenticated encryption scheme instead. The announcement for next week is that we'll actually be talking about authenticated encryption. And since the book somewhat predates the standardization of authenticated encryption, I did my best to assign some reading. I didn't actually get through assigning all of the exercises, so the exercises are likely to update today or tomorrow with a couple of more exercises. And I'm kind of looking around for better things to assign, but I assigned a couple of articles on Wikipedia and the Cloudflare blog, which is generally high quality. And we'll be getting some practice using authenticated encryption schemes this week with AES GCM and Cha-Cha Poly. Thanks everyone for joining this week. And if you have comments on things that you would like in a restructuring of subgroups, I would love your input. And then the last thing to draw your attention to is that there is going to be a poll this week. We would like to better understand who's taking the course. So there's going to be a short survey in the announcements channel as soon as we log off from the stream. And I'd love your feedback on how the course is going, sort of what you're feeling about the course, and maybe where you're coming from. And I suppose the thing that I've been teasing in the Discord for the last maybe week or two is that I'd like to have a job fair at the end of this particular course. I've spoken to a couple of firms that are interested in attending and maybe talking to some of you guys. So stick around for the course. And my advice to anyone who's seeking a job in cryptography is that it's not an easy topic to learn. This course is maybe my best attempt to help make it more approachable. But especially something like cryptography where there's a lot to learn and it can feel a bit overwhelming, use the Discord to sort of, I think, check in with other people who are learning in the same way. And there may be employers who are interested in how you worked through some of the exercises in this course. So yeah, stick around, and we'll look forward to having you next week. Thanks everyone for coming, and I think that's going to be it for today. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming.
Yep. Thanks, Chloe.